This is a quick disclaimer before the video starts that I'm not an expert on game design, marketing, or any of the other topics that I'll talk about in this video. Every conclusion I've drawn through my analysis has been derived from my own perspective and does not represent what may be true in reality. Genshin Impact is a free-to-play ARPG gacha game from the Chinese developer miHoYo that is available on PC, mobile devices, and most of the popular game consoles. The game is currently a little over a year old, but in this short amount of time the game's popularity has been steadily increasing, with an average of 56 million monthly players at the time of this recording. After experiencing the game for myself and seeing multiple controversies unfold over the past year, I thought it would be a better time now than ever to make an in-depth analysis on Genshin Impact. Being an ARPG game, short for action role-playing game, the game's gameplay runs on a couple core mechanics. The first core mechanic is elements. In the game, there are 7 unique elements, which are Pyro, Anemo, Electro, Dendro, Cryo, Hydro, and Geo. These elements react with each other to trigger special effects, such as Vaporize, Superconduct, Overload, and more. These special effects either allow players to generate more damage, or apply debuffs on enemies. In order to actually trigger these effects in the first place, each character in the game has one of the 7 elemental powers, which applies that element's effects on enemies that they target with their abilities. This ties us into the second core mechanic of combat systems. There are 2 main ways to attack in the game. The first is to use basic attacks, and the second way is to use abilities. Each character has their own unique skills, named their elemental skill and elemental burst, that allows them to apply their element on enemies. Mixing multiple characters of different elements in your team allows you to trigger those special effects mentioned earlier. With that, not only does the game provide an aspect of team building, but also allows players to play the game in various playstyles. This idea is further fortified by the buffs that are applied when your team is made of a combination of certain elements. Finally, in the category of combat systems is movement. Dashing and sprinting allows for players to quickly reposition during combat, or travel longer distances in a shorter amount of time. The dash also doubles as a dodge mechanic, giving an invincibility window to avoid incoming attacks. And finally, the glider allows players to glide around from the different elevated locations around the world, giving players an easier time when they're exploring. In Genshin Impact, characters are built upon equipment and stats, which is the third core mechanic. This is similar to most gacha games where progress is focused on stat inflation, allowing developers to effectively time gate players through energy systems. More on that later. So in Genshin Impact, there are 4 main methods to increase your character's stats. The first method, and easiest, is to level up your character. This is done through the use of EXP cards that can be earned from completing missions and opening chests around the world. At certain level milestones, extra materials are required for ascension in order to keep leveling that character up. The second method is weapons. Each character can be equipped with a weapon that adds damage bonuses and other effects. Similar to character leveling, weapons can also be leveled to increase their bonus stats that are provided to the character they are equipped on. Most low tier weapons can be found through world chests, but higher tier gear can only be obtained through the gacha system, story missions, events, and crafting. Next up is artifacts. Similarly to weapons, artifacts are equipped onto your characters through the use of 5 different slots, each accommodating its own type of artifact. These artifacts can also be leveled up to increase the stat bonuses they provide, while also adding new bonuses. Likewise to weapons, low tier artifacts are found through world chests, but higher tier artifacts can only be obtained through domain completions and world bosses. Additionally, artifacts come in themed sets, which provide extra bonuses when multiple of them are equipped on the same character. And lastly, obtaining multiple copies of a character through gacha pools. While some constellations increase stats on the character, most constellations instead provide extra effects and bonuses to the character's skills. Obtaining constellations is the hardest of the four, due to the fact that players are required to pull a duplicate copy of the character through Gacha. We've gone through how you can raise your character's stats, but now I'm going to explain why you need to raise your character's stats. Genshin's difficulty can be best described as artificial. What this means is that the game is made harder through the inflation of stats on enemies and bosses. As the game progresses, enemies get tougher through stat inflation, and such, players need to increase their own stats to match or exceed those of the enemy. Because of the game's fairly simple combat system, there's not much the player can do through mechanical skill that will grant them an obvious advantage. The best that they could do is repeatedly hit them over the course of maybe a couple of hours. Artificial difficulty is made even more apparent in the endgame of Genshin Impact, where Spiral Abyss is made difficult by having enemies with extremely inflated stats. Controversially, increasing one's stats through artifacts has been discussed to be part of the game's difficulty, due to the stats that they provide being rolled through RNG. However, RNG and stat drops of artifacts should be far from considered hard, since it's not really something that a player can do anything about, otherwise control. More on that later. If you have a decent understanding of game design and cycle of play, you may have been able to piece together your own opinion with the information previously mentioned. But if you're struggling to do that, I'm here to offer my perspective on this case. With combat systems being fairly simple for a role-playing game, the lack of difficulty in the form of player skill creates a system of progress that is too shallow to keep players engaged. The shallow progression system is further reinforced by the weapon and artifact system that serves more purpose to slow the progress of the player rather than increase depth. As players progress later into the game and are faced with the harsher effects of artificial difficulty, the importance of artifact farming and RNG drops becomes more apparent, ultimately creating mundane gameplay loops where players are stuck trying to increase their stats with little to nothing that they can do skill-wise to net them an advantage. This perspective is largely based on the gameplay mechanics and systems alone, but in the grand scheme of things, it seems to be more of a facilitatory aspect of the game. Fundamentally, Genshin Impact's popularity rides mostly off of its story, lore, and characters. So, let's talk about that. If you're unfamiliar with how the many stories that Genshin Impact has to offer are portrayed, then let me give you a quick rundown. Throughout the open world of Teyvat, players follow main story missions as they venture around the world. Players travel from region to region, with each region having their main storyline featuring casts of many different characters. Like most games that have stories, plot points are conveyed through character dialogue and cutscenes, making the game play like a visual novel of sorts, where occasionally the player is faced with combat scenarios functioning more like an action sequence. Although the playable story is incomplete at this point, there seems to be plenty of depth in it. I'm not going to go deep into the lore in this video because frankly I'm not qualified to do so, but there are many other videos on YouTube out there that discuss and explore the lore of the world. Apart from story missions, there are also character-specific story quests that follow a specific character and provide further insight into their personality and background. These quests not only serve as extra content for the player to consume, but also help in fleshing out the world by fitting characters into it with their unique roles. For the lore gurus and huge simps for waifus, there are even more detailed bits of information that can be found within the characters' personal pages. There's no doubt you can tell that MiHoYo really put effort into making sure that these characters are compelling to the player. As mentioned earlier, the playable story is very much incomplete, with MiHoYo releasing major updates from time to time that unlock new regions and stories for players to explore. This method of releasing content not only gives time for MiHoYo to develop more content for the player, but it also serves to time gate the player from progressing the story too fast. Since from a wider perspective, Genshin Impact's popularity stems from the storytelling, it just makes sense to release that content in large chunks over several periods of time, with the goal of keeping the player coming back to find out more about the world. In summary, the main goal of this strategy is to keep players engaged through the story by feeding players fresh content over periods of time. From a player's perspective, the system encourages them to play the game slowly and to enjoy the content for what it is. However, from a developer's perspective, this strategy is actually quite important to how the game is marketed and how money is made. Being a free-to-play game, Genshin Impact relies on its microtransactions and gacha systems to keep the game afloat. These microtransactions provide players with anything from extra Primo Gems, the game's premium currency, to premium Battle Pass rewards that provide the player with more character leveling resources. The gacha system is basically a glorified gambling hub, where players spend premium currency for the chance to pull the featured characters or weapons on the banner. Each character and weapon have rarities that determine the chance of pulling them. For example, 5-star characters and weapons have a 0.6% chance of being obtained. Additionally, a pity system is put in place. If you're unfamiliar with pity systems, they're quite common in gacha games and are a means to guarantee players a specific reward at a certain threshold. For Genshin Impact, gacha pools guarantee the player a 5-star drop when they haven't gotten one in 90 pools. There's been research done to see whether a soft pity system has been put in place, and that basically means incrementally increasing the chance for a 5-star after a certain threshold. However, MiHoYo has never specified whether this system exists, which means in my case, I'm not going to touch on it. I've taken it upon myself to build a little Python script that simulates pulling every 5-star character in Genshin Impact. But first, we kinda need to understand how the banner system works. In Genshin Impact, there are rotating character-specific banners that provide players with a chance to get that character, who would otherwise be unobtainable in other banners. When rolling for the character, upon pulling a 5-star, there's a 50-50 chance that the player receives the banner character or an off-banner character. If the player rolls on the character's specific banner and loses the 50-50, their next 5-star on the banner is guaranteed to be the banner character. There are currently 5 off-banner characters, which are Diluc, Keqing, Mona, Jean, and Qiqi, and they can be obtained through their separate pool of 5 from the permanent standard banner. Did you get that? Okay, moving on. There are a couple assumptions that had to be made in making this Python script. Firstly, since we didn't know how soft pity works in detail, a system for that was avoided. Secondly, when the system makes a pull, we always assume that they are pulling on a character-specific banner. If the character for the banner is pulled, the system would simulate switching to another character-specific banner. Additionally, because of this, we also have a tracking list of all the off-banner characters since they can be pulled when losing 50-50s. When all of the characters on character-specific banners have been pulled, the simulation checks if every off-banner character has been pulled. And if they have, then the simulation ends. If it hasn't, then it starts pulling on the standard banner. With that, the simulation continues pulling until all the characters have been obtained at least once. During the simulation, the script outputs the pull number whenever a 5-star is obtained, and whether or not it was because of the hard pity. The output also provides information as to whether the 50-50 on the banner was won or lost, as well as if a duplicate off-banner character was pulled. After running the simulation 10 times, here are some of the results. Within 10 runs, 4 of them finished without proceeding to pull on the standard banner, meaning all off-banner characters were obtained through 50-50 losses on character-specific banners. On average, 4.9 off-banner character duplicates were pulled, and 265,600 Primo Gems were required to pull each character at least once. Converting this amount of Primo Gems into Genesis packs, the total cost was about $4,100 meaning the cost of each character was about 205 USD each. The real numbers for a proper simulation run through the game's banner itself would probably be lower than what I found here due to the hidden soft pity system. However, I don't believe the difference would be drastic. Furthermore, this simulation was run as of December 8th, where there were only 20 5-stars in the game, including Arataki, Ito, and crew, who were yet to be released. Do what you will with this information, but here's my take. The amount of money required for each character is surprisingly decent, especially for gacha game standards. However, it's understandable when someone who is experiencing gacha systems through Genshin Impact for the first time may think that these numbers seem absurd. In Genshin Impact, the main form of grinding or farming comes in the form of artifacts. As mentioned earlier, artifacts serve the purpose of boosting your character's stats. In order to obtain them, players must clear domains with a resin requirement for claiming artifact rewards. Resin, in short, is Genshin Impact's stamina system. For many gacha games out there, a stamina system is put in place to time gate the player from getting too strong too fast. And since Genshin is also a gacha game, they're no different. This sucks for the player, especially since the RNG aspect means that theoretically, if you were the unluckiest person on Earth, you would get time gated forever. However, as mentioned earlier on the time gating of content releases, this strategy means that even the players that speedrun the story are slowed down on the endgame content of Spiral Abyss. To double down on the suckiness of the system, resin recharges at an extremely slow rate, and refreshes through premium currency are limited to 5 times a day. So not even the whales get a huge leap of progress. Ultimately, like every stamina system in other games, the resin system does an extremely good job of slowing down the player's stat boosting progress with the main goal of keeping the players playing for longer. But why would they need to keep the player playing for longer? Typically, in the gaming market, there are 3 ways to sell a game. The first way is premium, where a complete product is delivered to the player with a one-off payment. The second is freemium, where the base game is free but extra content is locked behind a paywall. And last but not least, free-to-play, where the game is completely free to play with mostly cosmetic items that are locked behind a paywall. It goes without saying that Genshin Impact falls under the free-to-play strategy, and I haven't really heard much talk about it, but this marketing strategy has become one of the main ways to market games, and there are a couple reasons for that. With free-to-play games, the barrier of entry is little to none, meaning there is almost no reason you shouldn't at least try the game. With that means you can pull in a wider audience, and with a wide audience pulled in, you're provided with more chances to earn through microtransactions. This is common with competitive multiplayer games, since player progression can easily be tied through a ranking system, ultimately leading to a very engaging gameplay loop. However, Genshin Impact is not like those games, and is instead at core a gacha game. For gacha games, the largest struggle is keeping the players engaged, and in order to do this, most gacha games have challenging endgame content, as well as many events to mix things up. Sometimes they also include auto-farming to make grinding a less mundane process. However, Genshin Impact is a rather unique case for gacha games, where the engaging content is not endgame content, but rather the story missions. This difference fundamentally changes who the target audience is, and for MiHoYo's case, the change is for the better. By making the story the main attraction for the game, in combination with the simple combat mechanics, an even larger audience of more casual players can be drawn in. The aim has not become to keep veteran players playing longer through difficult endgame content, but to constantly keep pulling in more players over time through more casual-friendly content. And with the ever-growing number of monthly players, it is apparent that this strategy is working. The strategy is definitely a fresher take within the gacha game genre, but the largest limiting factor is that MiHoYo needs to work tirelessly to make sure that their story content updates keep coming, since most of their player base rides on that. Filler content such as events and endgame content still exists to keep players engaged through major content updates, but from my experience they don't do a good job at keeping the player engaged. However, that's my opinion, and there's also another factor that keeps players engaged with the game. The Genshin Impact community is probably one of the largest gacha communities right now, especially since Genshin is the most popular gacha game. This is often likewise said for a lot of other games, but a dedicated community is bound to keep a game flourishing despite its own shortcomings. The Genshin Impact community definitely should receive credit where it's due, and it's a large contributing factor to how players can keep engaged with the game. There seems to be an endless supply of high-quality fan art coming from fans around the world, which spans across multiple forms of social media. Fan art can be a means of connecting players together through their shared love for a character, which not only bands players together, but can also reinforce their love for the game. Speaking of fan-generated content, There are an abundance of guides and informative videos out there that can assist the large player base in exploring every nook and cranny of the world, or even provide tips on character and team building. This allows even more casual players who might have never touched a game in their life to keep playing without issue. Even meme videos help humor the community with relatable jokes or funny encounters. Short clips featuring absurd damage numbers also serve as a form of encouragement for players grinding artifacts by providing a goal in sight. I haven't mentioned everything positive about the community because that would take way too long, and I think it's fairly easy to see how the community is able to make the game more interesting and engaging. However, the community can also be the downfall for the game. In August of 2021, a group of voice actors started getting attacked over their vocal performance in the game. I'm not too sure of the severity of this situation, however the next one was way more apparent. Upon the announcement of the new 5-star character Kokomi, the community was quite outraged by her skills due to the fact that they were weak. So what better way to express their anger than take it out on the voice actor for their character while she was live streaming. It's extremely upsetting to see that people would result in this over something as unimportant as a weak character. And when the community was faced with criticism from outside, many turned to defend themselves, saying that toxic behavior from those people were of a vocal minority. However, when the problem can become this huge through a so-called minority, I don't think you can call it a minority anymore. Ever since the whole 1-year anniversary disaster, the state of the community has become really quite clear. What MiHoYo did during the event certainly wasn't a great display of thankfulness towards their fanbase, however the backlash from the community itself was completely out of line. If you're unfamiliar with what happened, let me summarize. During the 1st-year anniversary event, most of the extra rewards being handed out involved competitions, namely art competitions. And apart from the competitions, in-game free rewards were extremely lacking and only provided enough for 10 pulls. Furthermore, most of the extras came from buying bundles. The community felt like MiHoYo should have provided more for them, especially because they had supported the game for a year. They also felt that the art competition really just doubled as extra publicity for the game. In a fit of rage, members of the community turned to throwing a tantrum, review bombing the game on the App Store, as well as other games from MiHoYo, and random apps on the App Store like Google Classroom. Eventually MiHoYo caved in and ended up giving out more rewards, but that was really nothing more than damage control. It goes without saying that most players in the community are not like this, but because of the game's free-to-play nature and its popularity, that small percentage is still a huge number of people. A number of people large enough to truly make a negative impact. For the future, it's up to MiHoYo to make sure that they can keep their community pleased, making sure that another 1-year anniversary fiasco doesn't occur again. It's hard to decide what could be changed for the game, but if changes were to be made, I definitely think that the endgame content should receive an overhaul. Spiral Abyss is just not something that is enjoyable or should be seen as difficult. And there are dozens of ways to make more interesting endgame content, such as raid dungeons with different bosses or advanced puzzles. In this way, players who enjoy challenging content or do not care as much for the story can still be encouraged to play. I would also suggest improving the artifact system, but there are many factors to consider from the perspective of MiHoYo as the developer. As someone who really enjoys the challenges that games can provide, it's pretty safe to say that Genshin Impact was not really a game for me. As I wrote this analysis, I found myself constantly searching for the negatives. But through speaking to people who love the game, I've been able to broaden my perspective as a whole. From what I've heard and learned through analyzing, Genshin Impact is very much a game that was made to appeal to as large of an audience as possible. And they excelled in achieving this through their beautiful graphics, engaging story, and easy to play mechanics. When I first played the game, I sped through the story and was met with the mundane endgame loop, which ultimately killed my motivation to play. And from this I learned that the way you play the game strongly impacts the amount of enjoyment that you can get out of it. In short, I believe that the best way to play Genshin is to sit back and enjoy the ride, and there's no need to rush to the finish line. Another random thing I'd like to mention about the game's genres of RPG and Gacha is that the game feels like it should have been pure RPG. The aspect of locking characters behind Gacha feels like it goes behind the back of what a role-playing game should be, and seems nothing more than a move by MiHoYo to market the game as free-to-play and hopefully rake in more money. But ultimately, I think this was more of a net win for both MiHoYo and the player base than maybe selling the game as a premium. And with my final thoughts out of the way, I'd like to re-emphasize that this analysis video was made to inform and educate on the deeper aspects of Genshin Impact as a game, where ultimately I hope that you'll be able to form your own opinion and perspective rather than base it off what someone else said. Lastly, I want to give a huge shout out to other people on the screen now for providing their insights on the game, as well as supporting me throughout the duration of this project. I really couldn't do it without them. If you feel like I missed something out or wanted to share your own perspective on Genshin Impact, feel free to leave a comment down below, and leave a like if you enjoyed the video. It really goes a long way. And with that, I'll see you guys next time.